He didn't just lose a rap battle. He lost the one thing a billion streams can never buy back. And the most explosive part is this. The blueprint for his downfall was sitting in plain sight for years before Kendrick Lamar ever opened his mouth on a record. The whispers started a while back, but nobody in a position of influence wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant admitting that the most reliable hit-making machine in modern music had a structural crack running straight through the foundation. And now, with the smoke cleared, the scoreboard settled, and a federal lawsuit on the docket, the entire culture is quietly retracing the timeline and arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. It all happened exactly the way a tiny circle of insiders said it would. Not the blogs, not the labels, not the streaming numbers. The people who actually knew both men. Now, settle in, because a recent sit-down with Glasses Malone might be the single most important piece of testimony to surface since the war itself. And I know exactly how that sounds. Glasses Malone is not the name anybody circled as the keeper of the missing chapter. But that is precisely what makes this so nuclear. Here is a man with a genuine, decade-spanning relationship with both sides of the battlefield. He comes from the same Los Angeles streets that raised Kendrick Lamar. He watched Kendrick grow from a neighborhood kid into the most feared pen in the genre. And at the very same time, he was formerly signed to Cash Money, moving through the exact label ecosystem Drake called home. You could count on one hand the number of people alive who can speak on both of these men from the inside, with receipts and history on both ends. He is one of them. So when he sat down on the TUG podcast and started calmly detailing private conversations he had with Kendrick before and after like that dropped, the culture should have stopped everything it was doing. Because what he described does not just add color to the story we all watched unfold in real time. It reframes the entire war. But before we get to the phone call that changes everything, you have to understand the fuse, because the fuse was lit months before anybody heard a single bar. Cast your mind back to first-person shooter. On its face, it was a victory lap. 2 friends, a #1 record, a playful coronation. But buried inside that playfulness was the phrase that detonated everything. The Big Three. The idea that the summit of the entire genre was a roundtable of exactly 3 men, and that membership was theirs to define. To the casual listener, it sounded like a compliment. To the man being fitted for 3rd place, it sounded like a verdict. And here is the detail that makes it sinister in hindsight. We now know Kendrick was allegedly offered that very record before it ever reached anyone else. He passed. And the moment he passed, the table was set without him, and the marketing of the Big Three rolled on as if his silence were consent. It was not consent. It was a countdown. Let's get to that phone call, because that is where the mythology dies. According to Malone, he and Kendrick had barely reconnected after more than a year of silence. 12, 13 months without a real conversation, and that detail matters more than anything else in the interview, because it kills the ambush theory in its crib. Drake's camp spent the better part of 2024 selling the idea that the whole thing was a coordinated hit, a label-backed, premeditated takedown cooked up in boardrooms months in advance. But here is Kendrick Lamar's own longtime friend telling the world that when they finally reconnected, nobody was plotting anything. They were talking about cars. Kendrick was bragging about the GNX he had just picked up, talking trash about racing, swearing he could smoke Malone on the open road, and Malone was laughing at him, telling him that car is not fast enough. That is the headspace the so-called mastermind was in. And then, in the middle of that perfectly ordinary conversation, Kendrick said the sentence that should be carved into the history of this battle. He said, "Man, I'm gonna do something crazy. Something crazy is gonna happen." Malone asked him what in the world that was supposed to mean. And the answer was 2 words. Just watch. Just watch. Sit with that for a second. No manifesto. No work council. No 12-step marketing rollout. Just a man who already knew exactly what he was about to do. Casually enjoying a conversation about Cadillacs while the biggest bomb in modern hip-hop sat armed on a hard drive. That is not what premeditation looks like. That is what confidence looks like. And when like that finally detonated on the Future and Metro Boomin album, Malone says he picked up the phone immediately. And this next detail is the one that should make every single person who bought the ambush narrative sit all the way down and rethink everything. Because according to Malone, when they spoke after the record dropped, Kendrick did not believe Drake would respond. Read that again. The alleged architect of a pre-planned destruction was on the phone telling his friend that Drake would be, in his words, the dumbest man alive to shoot back. Kendrick's reasoning, as Malone related, was pure fight economics. Why would the biggest commercial artist on the planet step into the ring over one verse? What could he possibly gain? A fighter has to care about the fights he makes. In Kendrick's mind, the smart play for Drake was to absorb the shot, let the news cycle pass, and keep printing money. That was the whole calculus. There was no expectation of war. Now hold on, because this is where the story stops sounding like gossip and starts sounding like prophecy. Days later, Push UPS leaked. And Malone's reaction is the reaction the entire culture had. He is simply the only one with the honesty to say it out loud on a microphone. He heard it and thought it was good. He said the hook was strong. He said he texted Kendrick 4 words that ended up summarizing the entire spring of 2024. You in a fight. You in a fight. From that moment forward, Malone says he watched the war like a man watching his little brother step into a ring they both grew up training in, against an opponent from a record label they both once belonged to. Nobody else in the commentary space has that vantage point, and it bleeds through every observation he made. And what came next was a masterclass in escalation that film schools will be teaching for decades. Because Kendrick did not answer push-ups with chaos. He answered it with euphoria, and Euphoria is a record that deserves its own chapter in the history books. On the surface it sounded serious, surgical, almost mournful, like a man delivering a diagnosis rather than a diss. But listen closer, and it is pure schoolyard flame dressed in a surgeon's coat. I hate the way that you walk, the way that you talk. That is not battle rapping. That is a man roasting your entire existence the way kids do on a playground, except with the best pen of a generation. It was comedy and execution at the same time, and the culture felt both. Then came 616 in LA, a shot fired on the opponent's own signature format, the timestamp record, which is the musical equivalent of beating a man at his own house, at his own game, with his own controller. Every move said the same thing. There is no arena you can pick where I do not already live. Because here is what Malone saw while the rest of the internet was too busy picking teams to notice anything. He watched Drake abandon his own deadliest weapon in the middle of a fight for supremacy. And this is the part that changes everything about how the outcome should be understood. Drake is, by any honest historical measure, one of the greatest hook writers the genre has ever produced. That is not an insult. That is the throne. Those hooks are why his records live in stadiums, on wedding playlists, in every algorithm on earth. It is the single most bankable skill in the music business. And in the highest stakes battle of his life, Drake released a barrage of diss records containing essentially one real hook between them. Push UPS had a hook. That was it. The rest was rapping. 6 minutes at a time. Beat switches. Timestamp energy. Bars stacked on bars stacked on bars. And Malone's question is the one that should haunt Drake's camp forever. Why would you walk into a battle for supremacy and leave your deadliest weapon sitting in the car? And let's be precise about the most misunderstood record of the war, because Family Matters deserves an honest autopsy. As a piece of rapping, it is formidable. 3 beat switches, real venom, moments where you can hear exactly why this man ruled a decade. It was clearly an attempt to fight fire with fire, to answer a long diss with a longer one, to play the game on the opponent's terms. And that was the trap. Because the moment he stepped into that arena, he was competing in a discipline where the other man is arguably the best to ever do it. The disses aimed at Kendrick specifically were the weakest links in the chain, and some of them were not just weak, they were reckless, the kind of accusations that do not age, the kind that turn a rap battle into something uglier. And then, before the smoke from Family Matters had even cleared, Meet the Grahams landed like a missile in the dead of night. Malone said what half the culture was thinking. He would hate to have a song made about him like that one. It was not a diss record. It was a seance. It addressed a man's family member by family member, in a tone so calm it was terrifying. Whatever you think of the battle, that is a haunting no artist ever fully walks off. Because meanwhile, what did Kendrick Lamar do next? Kendrick made the whole world laugh. And this is the strategic layer that every bar-for-bar debate on the internet completely misses. Malone said it plainly. A battle is not scored by who lands the most technically impressive 16. It is scored by who makes the other man look the stupidest. That is the entire lineage of the sport. The Bridge is Over did not win on syllable counts. It won because it made one side of town laugh at the other. The immortal diss records are the ones people can enjoy. And that is the genius of Not Like Us. It is not just an accusation. It is a party. A comedian with a flamethrower. 100 jokes at one man's expense. A hook the entire planet could chant on first listen. And a video that turned the mockery into a family reunion. The world was not merely hearing that Drake lost. The world was having fun watching it happen. And once the world is laughing at you, the fight is over. Everything after that is paperwork. And if you want to understand how completely the culture crowned that record, look at what happened on one June night in Los Angeles. The pop-out was not a concert. It was a coronation. An entire city's rap history on one stage. Generations of West Coast artists standing shoulder to shoulder, and an arena full of people chanting a diss record like it was the national anthem. Gang rivals in the same building, united by a song. Nobody alive could remember anything like it. because there had never been anything like it. Battles are supposed to end with think pieces. This one ended with a civic holiday. And when the Not Like Us video dropped days later, shot on the very soil the opponent had allegedly been poking around, the message was not even subliminal. It was a flag planted in the ground. And the paperwork is exactly where this story takes its darkest turn. Because when Drake filed that lawsuit against Universal Music Group, alleging the label defamed him by promoting Not Like Us, the culture's reaction was visceral, and Glass's Malone became its most credible voice. Here is why his words carry a weight 1,000 social media threads never could. Malone is on record, for years, defending Drake. When the story broke about T.I.'s associate and that infamous stage incident, Malone said publicly that it was not right. When the story surfaced about Lil Wayne slapping him, about Puff putting hands on him, Malone said the same thing every time. This man is not on that timing. He told everybody, stop celebrating it. When Drake battled Meek Mill, Malone publicly urged him to stand up for himself, and when Drake won, Malone said he was happy for him. He admits, flat out, that Drake makes great songs. He calls him a good MC, not to be played with. His words, on the record, years before any of this. So understand what it means when that man, that specific man, with that specific history of extending Drake every possible benefit of the doubt, looked at the lawsuit and called it the first thing Drake ever did in his entire career that he did not like. The first time, Malone said he could excuse a man for not being a street fighter. That is not everybody's bag to carry, and everybody knows exactly where Drake comes from. But suing a record company for promoting a diss record aimed at you? In a battle? In a genre whose entire tradition says you answer with a record? Malone's verdict was brutal in its simplicity. If you are suing over a record dissing you, when your own catalog is stacked with records defaming other people's characters, then what did you think this sport was? And the sharpest blade in the whole interview was the hypocrisy angle. Because Drake has a line of his own, from his own catalog, declaring that the cease and desist is for cowards. Cleaned up for broadcast, but that is the bar. His own standard, in his own lyrics. And yet before the battle had even fully ignited, there were already reports of a cease and desist connected to like that. Allegedly. Say it with me. Allegedly. Then, when the war was lost, the situation escalated from a reported cease and desist to an actual federal lawsuit. So by the arithmetic of Drake's own lyric, what does that make the lawsuit? Malone did the math out loud. If a cease and desist is beneath the culture, then a lawsuit over a rap battle is exponentially worse. That became, in his words, the moment the public image cracked. Not because of anything Kendrick accused him of, because of what Drake himself did the moment the music stopped. And this is the part that changes everything. Because Malone also revealed something almost nobody knew in real time. During the battle, the internet saw the Not Like Us video packed with West Side figures and assumed the streets were simply rallying behind their own. But according to Malone, what came out afterward painted a very different picture of what had been happening behind the scenes. Drake had allegedly been to Compton, Kendrick's home soil, moving with certain elements, looking for information, applying pressure where the cameras could not see. Money in the streets. Feelers out. And here is the thing that should chill anybody paying attention. It is the same playbook allegedly run during the Pusha T war years earlier. Dig for dirt. Find the angle. Weaponize the personal. It was a red flag then. In hindsight, it became the confirmation. For one of these men, the battle was never just songs. None of this was known in real time. Malone says he did not know either. He was living his own life, running his own race, supporting his friend from a distance the way he always had. Buying the albums, going to the signings, minding his business. And that distance is exactly what makes the testimony bulletproof. This is not a man who sat in a war room. This is a man watching the timeline get rewritten after the fact, piece by piece, as the hidden moves crawled into the light. When it turns out one competitor was working angles off the record while the other was simply writing, the whole story inverts. The paranoid one starts looking prophetic. The polished one starts looking desperate. And then there is the J. Cole chapter, the quiet casualty of the entire war, and maybe the most uncomfortable stretch of Malone's account. For a long time, J. Cole occupied a unique space in the culture. The stand-up one, the thoughtful one, the middle-class poet who stayed above the mess. And Malone admits he bought that image completely. He says it himself. He is catching up to the history in real time like the rest of us, because for years he was not tracking the subliminals. He did not know about the older records where Drake and Cole were trading shots at Kendrick over an MTV list. He did not realize Control was, in part, a response to energy that had been building for years. But as the internet retraced the steps after 2024, the picture that emerged genuinely bothered him. Because there was J. Cole, on record after record, smiling next to a man who was taking shots at the homie. There was the first-person shooter verse, the Big Three talk, the whole coronation, while Kendrick was being quietly positioned as the odd man out. And when Kendrick finally kicked the door off the hinges, J. Cole stepped into the fight for roughly one record, apologized for it on stage, and stepped right back out. Malone's language here was careful but devastating. He said it made him look at Cole as maybe a little unsavory, not the person he presents. Two different people, the one performing integrity and the one playing both sides of the fence. Whether you agree or not, the disappointment in his voice is the kind that only comes from someone who truly believed. He said it plainly. He bought it. He bought the idea that Cole was a stand-up dude. And the retrace made him feel like the product did not match the packaging. Now, let's be fair for a second, because fairness matters when you are talking about legacies. There is a version of this story where Drake is simply a competitor who got outmaneuvered, where J. Cole is simply a man who decided his piece was worth more than a war, where the lawsuit is just a businessman protecting his brand through the only channel he has left. That version exists. People in the culture hold it sincerely. And Malone himself kept repeating that the competition was healthy. Two giants testing each other is good for the sport. Nobody reasonable disputes that. But here is where the fairness runs out. Because competition has rules that predate every streaming platform and every label contract ever signed. When you enter a rap battle, the battlefield is the booth. That is the covenant. Every legend who ever laced up a microphone understood it. And the culture's verdict on 2024 was never really about who had the better bars, the bigger numbers, or the louder fan base. The verdict was about who honored the covenant and who reached for the referee. Kendrick Lamar won on the scoreboard, in the streets, at the Grammys, at the Super Bowl. And still, the war followed him home. People close to the situation have spoken about the real-world spillover. Swatting calls. Family members pulled into danger. Consequences that never show up in a streaming count. That is the layer beneath the memes. That is what the battle actually cost. And that is when it clicked for people. Go back and listen to Kendrick's moves through the lens Malone just handed you. The GNX taunts before any of it started. The post about lining people up, flipping the script, coming outside. That was not a man setting a trap. That was a man announcing that the quiet season was over. He had let everybody have their fun while he was inside. And now he was back outside. And he wanted it on record that he warned everybody first. Even the album told the story. The internet swore for months that Kendrick had a vault of pre-written Drake disses waiting for a coordinated rollout. Then GNX dropped, and there was not a single diss record on it. The so-called Ambush album turned out to be a victory lap about everything except the war. The grand plan Drake imagined never existed. What existed was a man who wrote his answers in real time, locked in for weeks at a stretch, and had a response loaded for every angle the moment it appeared. Offense, defense, counter, bait. Whatever was required, he had it chambered. Not because a label handed him a war plan, because that is who he is when the bell rings. Meanwhile, the other side of the board kept making the same move over and over and expecting a different result. Records that picked the fight back up long after the public had moved on. A rollout strategy seemingly engineered to prove the battle never ended, at the exact moment the whole world could see that it had. Even Malone, a man who genuinely enjoys Drake's music, said the post-battle output confused him. Songs poking at the ashes. Moments that read like a fighter still swinging at an opponent who already left the ring. His advice, delivered with the bluntness of a front-row witness, was simple. Take the loss. Go quiet. Regroup. Rebuild around the thing that made you undeniable in the first place. The hooks. The anthems. The records the whole world sang along to whether they liked rap or not. Because the road back was never through the courts, and it was never through pretending the war was still live. The road back was through the music. It always was. And let's go deeper on that for a moment, because the psychology of it is the most fascinating layer of this entire saga. Think about what it means for an artist whose entire empire was built on instinct, on an almost supernatural feel for what the world wants to sing, to suddenly stop trusting that instinct at the exact moment he needed it most. Every record before the battle was a calculator's dream. Every move after it has felt like a man arguing with the scoreboard. And the tragedy, the genuine tragedy, is that the skill never left him. The hooks are still in there. The melodies are still in there. What changed was the posture. And posture is everything in this sport. The audience can smell desperation through a pair of headphones. They can smell confidence too. One man made a song so confident the world turned it into a national anthem. The other man made a lawsuit. History is not confused about which is which. And we need to say this plainly, because it keeps getting lost in the noise. Being a phenomenal hitmaker and being a battle rapper are two completely different crafts, and the culture did itself a disservice pretending they were the same credential. One craft is about giving millions of strangers a feeling they want to live inside. The other is about taking one specific man apart in front of the entire world with nothing but rhythm and vocabulary. Drake mastered the first craft so completely that everyone, maybe including Drake himself, assumed the second one came with the package. It did not. It never did. The warning signs were there in every skirmish that came before. Look at the pattern honestly. The battles he won were won on tempo, on hooks, on flooding the zone with catchy material until the other side drowned in it. That is a legitimate weapon. But it only works against opponents who need the same oxygen. Against a man who does not care about radio, who disappears for years and returns with a Pulitzer, who treats every verse like a deposition, the flood strategy has nothing to flood. You cannot outchant a man who is not competing for the chant. And that mismatch, that fundamental misunderstanding of what the fight actually was, explains everything that happened next. And if you want proof that the lesson still had not landed, look at what came after the funeral. Because the months following the battle produced a stretch of releases that had the entire culture scratching its head in unison. Records that kept jabbing at a ghost. Songs asking what did I miss, when the honest answer was everything. A rollout teased like a horror franchise. All masked figures and ominous trailers, built to convince the world the war was still raging at the exact moment the world had already buried it. Malone's reaction was the one you only get from somebody who actually roots for you. He was not mocking it. He was confused by it. This is a man who had spent years telling anyone who would listen that Drake was a genuinely good MC, and even he could not decode the strategy. Get back to your strengths, he said, in essence. Stop swinging at an opponent who already left the ring. And that critique lands so much harder than any Stan War insult, because it comes from concern, not contempt. There is a particular kind of pain in watching a fighter with legendary tools keep reaching for the wrong one. The hooks were always the superpower. The anthems were always the empire. And somewhere in the scramble to prove the loss never happened, the greatest hitmaker of his generation forgot the single thing that made him inevitable in the first place. And while we are talking about the anatomy of a loss, we have to talk about the silence around it. Because one of the loudest parts of this whole story is who never spoke. The industry machine that spent a decade orbiting Drake, the streaming platforms that plastered his face on every playlist cover, the media ecosystem that treated his every release like a national holiday. When the verdict of the culture came down, that machine had nothing to say. No emergency summit. No counter-programming that landed. Just the slow, awkward realization that for the first time in a decade, the biggest artist in the world needed defending, and nobody with a platform wanted the job. That silence told its own story. And the people who did speak, the Malones of the world, the ones with actual history and nothing to gain, all told some version of the same story. Not that Drake was finished, but that Drake had finally revealed the ceiling of the strategy that made him. Dominance through ubiquity works until the day the culture decides to judge you on a single battlefield, under the oldest rules in the book. It is also worth stepping back and looking at what this whole chapter did to the audience itself, because that is the part nobody monetizes correctly. For 10 years, listeners were trained to believe that numbers were the argument. Biggest first week. Most chart entries. Longest streak. The battle of 2024 snapped that spell in half. In the space of 8 weeks, the culture remembered that the scoreboard and the crown are two different things, and that the crown has never once been decided by a spreadsheet. An entire generation of rap fans got to watch the old laws get enforced in real time. Answer the record. Respect the ring. Never let them see you reach for the referee. These are not rules anybody wrote down. They are rules everybody knows. And the enforcement of them was not cruel. It was, if anything, overdue. That is why the celebration was so loud. It was not just about one man winning. It was about the sport itself getting its soul back. There is one more thread from that interview that deserves the spotlight, because it explains the emotional core of everything Malone said. When he talked about watching the battle, he described it as watching his young homie go to war against somebody from a record label they both came up under. Sit with how strange and rare that position is. The Battle of 2024 was not just a clash between two fan bases. It was a clash between two families that used to be one family. Cash Money, Young Money, the West Coast lineage, the shared features, the shared festivals, the shared decade. Everybody in that orbit knew everybody. And when the war went hot, every single person in that orbit had to make a quiet decision about where they stood, and most of them made it by saying nothing at all. Malone is notable precisely because he refused the silence. He said what the entire middle of the industry was thinking but was too entangled, too employed, or too afraid to say. And he said it with love for both sides, which is exactly why it landed like an indictment. The most damaging testimony never comes from your enemies. It comes from the friend who walks into the room, puts a hand on your shoulder, and tells the truth anyway. And here is the layer almost nobody wants to touch, because it is the most human part of the entire saga. Strip away the plaques and the streams and the stadiums, and what you are left with is a story about two men who were once on the same side of history. Remember, these are artists who came up saluting each other. Early features, shared stages, public respect. There was a version of the future where the two biggest rappers of their generation stayed allies, traded verses for 20 years, and retired as the genre's greatest friendship. That version died somewhere between a rejected feature and a big three coronation, and the culture is still grieving it, whether it admits that or not. That grief is the engine under all the engagement. People are not just consuming a battle. They are processing a breakup. The most famous Cold War in music finally went hot, and everybody who grew up on both catalogs got drafted into a side they never asked to choose. That is why every new detail, every leaked conversation, every podcast confession lands like an aftershock. The audience is not looking for gossip. They are looking for closure. And closure is the one thing this story has refused to give anyone. Which is exactly why the Malone account matters more than the hundreds of hours of commentary that came before it. Most of the battle coverage was noise. Fans litigating syllables. Bots inflating narratives. Channels farming outrage. But every once in a while, a primary source walks into the room, and the whole discourse has to reorganize itself around what they say. That is what happened here. A man with no dog in the fight beyond friendship, no brand deal riding on the outcome, no algorithm to feed, sat down and calmly redrew the map. And the map he drew shows the same thing from every angle. The ambush was a myth. The warning was real. The response was improvised genius, not a boardroom operation. And the aftermath, the cease and desist reports, the lawsuit, the records poking at the ashes, was not strategy. It was the sound of an empire hearing laughter for the first time and not knowing what to do with it. And let's be honest about the elephant in the boardroom, because no honest account of this era is complete without it. When the battle ended, the most powerful man in music did not respond the way powerful men in this genre have always responded. He did not go back to the lab. He did not assemble a team of the sharpest pens money could buy and return with a record so undeniable that the culture had no choice but to respect it. That option was always on the table. It is still on the table. Instead, the response went through lawyers, and that choice told the world something no diss record ever could. It said the music was no longer the arena where this man believed he could win. For an artist who spent 15 years insisting he was the genre's final boss, that is not a legal strategy. That is a confession. And the entire culture heard it, whether they were willing to say it out loud or not. And for anyone still clinging to the numbers argument, let's settle that right now, because it is the last shelter the losing side has left. Yes, the commercial statistics are absurd. Yes, the chart records may never be touched. But understand something about the history of this art form. Every single era eventually stops being measured in sales and starts being measured in moments. Nobody sits around today debating first-week scans from 2001. They debate the records. They debate the battles. They debate who stood tall when the culture demanded a verdict. Takeover versus Ether is not a spreadsheet conversation. The bridge is over is not a spreadsheet conversation. And 20 years from now, when the streaming tallies of 2024 are trivia nobody can recite, the only thing anyone will remember is a stadium full of people in Los Angeles chanting in unison while the biggest pop star on earth watched his name become a punchline. That is not hate. That is just how memory works in this genre. The scoreboard fades. The moment is forever. So where does that leave the legacy question? Because that is what all of this is really about now. Kendrick Lamar walked out of 2024 with his mythology not just intact, but expanded. The recluse who warned everybody. The writer who needed no vault. The competitor who never once stepped outside the bounds of the sport. And Drake walked out with the same numbers he always had, plus a question mark he never used to carry. Not about his talent. Nobody honest questions the talent. The question is about what happens when the talent loses. When the machine cannot chart its way out. When the only remaining move is a legal filing, and the whole culture is watching to see whether a man who built his name on records will stand behind the ones he made. And do not mistake this for an ending, because the next act is already being written in court filings and release schedules. The lawsuit has to survive judges who will be asked to decide whether a diss record can defame anyone in a genre built on defamation, and whatever happens, the precedent will echo through every battle that comes after it. Meanwhile, both camps are moving. New music is coming. Old alliances are being tested. And somewhere in Los Angeles, the man who said just watch is almost certainly watching again, quiet as ever, letting the world wonder what he already knows. That is the scariest part of all. The silence was never empty. It never is. The history books of this genre are ruthless about one thing above all else. They do not remember the excuses. They remember the moments. And the moment this era will be remembered for is not a courtroom sketch or a streaming record. It is a city singing in unison. It is a friend on the phone saying you in a fight. It is a warning that said, just watch, and a world that did not listen until it was far too late. And one last thought on J. Cole before we close, because his chapter is the one people keep skipping. J. Cole made the most human decision of the whole war. He felt the disrespect, stepped up, fired back, and then listened to the voice in his chest that said this is not who you are. The culture mocked him for it in the moment, but look at where everyone landed. J. Cole is the only one of the three who walked away with his peace fully intact. No lawsuits, no scars that needed explaining, no legacy question hanging over his head. History may end up judging his exit as the smartest move any of them made. Cole saw the cliff before anybody else did, and he simply refused to drive off it. Now I want to hear from you, because this one is going to split the room right down the middle. Was the lawsuit a smart businessman protecting a billion-dollar brand, or the single worst move in battle rap history? And be honest with yourself. Did Glasses Malone just change how you see the entire war? Or was your mind already made up before you clicked? Sound off in the comments, because I read every single one. If you are new here, hit subscribe and turn the notifications on, because the next layer of this story is already unfolding. There are court dates on the calendar and documents that have not seen daylight yet, and when they drop, this whole conversation is going to look completely different. Trust me, you are going to want to be here for that one.